Hello, everybody. Let's talk about Japan and China, where things are heating up again and where it becomes gradually clearer that the US is also involved and tries to stoke up tensions in a concerted effort, obviously for its own benefits. So, to put it in context again, following the statements of the Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi, who is widely seen as a China hawk and a nationalist, which suggested that military action by China against Taiwan could justify response from Japan, China became obviously infuriated, stating that these were internal affairs and that Japan should stay out of that because basically the whole world accepts the one China policy, which states that Taiwan, although of course acting outside the control of Beijing, is in fact part of China and not an independent country. Now, a few days ago, Japan has sent a delegation to China, seemingly to discuss the matter and calm things down, but they left yesterday without finding any compromise. And now, as the delegation has left, China is ramping up retaliation against Japan, and it is aiming to hurt Japan's already fragile economy. It halted already Chinese traveling to Japan, and yesterday Beijing said it was halting Japanese seafood imports and movie releases. So obviously, Beijing is now hurt in Tokyo, where it hurts not only rhetoric but also, of course, trying to inflict economic pain. Now, a blow to tourism is, of course, an unwelcome drag in Japan after the country reported its first quarterly GDP contraction in more than a year. So the economy is not doing very well at all. And of course, Beijing knows that, and they will try to hit it and hurt them even more. But in fact, and this is the topic of my video today, what is the fuss really all about? Because on the surface, it looks just like a dispute around Taiwan, but it actually is about much, much more than that. And for that, one needs to take a closer look at what was actually being said by the Japanese Prime Minister. The issue is that the statement that she made makes it look that Japan is now steering away from its policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan. And she suggests in a statement that an attack on Taiwan could amount to a survival threatening situation, and this is a very important phrase, that would permit Japan to exercise collective self defense. Now, China is especially angry about this response and that phrase, survival threatening situation. And you see very clearly in China, where I live, from the central government to the local government to the media, to local media, to social media, to the people here, there's a universal condemnation of what has been said. Because basically, this is not only about the fact that Japan intervenes in what China, of course, considers domestic affairs, but especially this phase, survivor threatening situation, really reminds us something about what happened, of course, in the 20th century and, of course, the invasion of Japan in China. And for that, of course, we need to go back a bit in history and give some context. Now, obviously, as we know, there are long historical wounds between in China caused by the Japanese military expansion, which was actually started already in 1895, and then of course more famously and more recently between 1931 and 1945. And remember that during the Second World War, there were around 30 million Chinese were killed, so an awful lot of money with people with loads of atrocities, notably, of course, the Nanjing massacre. And of course, the Japanese really never atoned for that. And as a matter of fact, they even celebrate these war criminals every year at the Yasukuni Shrine. Now, the problem, of course, is that in those days, the Japanese government told the people that they need to have this survival mode, that they need to invade China because it was a mortal threat to Japan. Because at that time, Japan basically was under embargo from the United States. It didn't have enough resources anymore. It didn't have oil before it invaded. Basically, it needed to invade China. Japan claimed because it was a matter of survival, and it was a survival threatening situation. That's why they invaded China. Now, obviously, using again now this exactly same phrase is of course a very very stupid thing and a very sensitive thing to use this in China. And of course, when you link now this historical fact, an invasion in China because it was survival for Japan, linking this to the Taiwan Strait issue, which of course China considers as a domestic issue, this obviously sends a very strong signal of a potential military intervention. And that, of course, reminds very clearly of what happened in the 1930s. And that is why the reaction of China is so strong. And that is the basic logic behind that, besides a second point to which I come back in a few minutes. Now, what is beside China, what is actually the reaction in Taiwan? Well, Taiwan is quite divided. Now, some people in Taiwan actually say that Japan has no business in intervening into the cross-strait situation between China and Taiwan, basically, and that in fact this intervention, this statement, will reduce the flexibility of Taiwan in forming its own strategy and policy to deal with China, basically. And then there's another side who is very much different and very celebratory, basically. And they think that the Japanese prime minister's statement is a fantastic, is a great thing. And they have claimed that this is the most outspoken, the most direct support of the current government, who wants, of course, more independence of Taiwan. So, of course, this is a very complicated situation in Taiwan because actually what happened in 1895, the first Sino-Japanese War, that actually was the root cause of the colonization of Taiwan. And then in 1945, after the Second World War, Taiwan was returned to China before it came, of course, the refugee place of the nationalists who lost the Civil War in China and then actually escaped to Taiwan. But basically, between 1895 and 1945 is the root cause of Taiwan's current separatist movement, basically. And an important fact here is that at the very first stage of these 50 years, there was a lot of military aggression from Japan and a lot of massacres also in Taiwan. And there are estimates that between 400,000 and 600,000 people were killed because of the Japanese. Now, of course, in part of Taiwan, the one that celebrates the statement from the prime minister, the Japanese prime minister, this part, of course, is largely forgotten or deliberately ignored, put it like this. And the idea there is that Japan has, in fact, helped Taiwan to become an independent country or independent region from China, basically. And that, of course, then suggests a very strong cultural affinity between Taiwan and Japan. So the Japanese prime minister's issue, the statement, is here, of course, in this slide, not only seen as a sign of a political or military support of the current regime in Taiwan, but also a kind of a cultural and a historical validation of the self-identity of those Taiwanese who actually imagine a kind of a glorious Japanese colonial rule period from 1895 on, of course, ignoring the fact that over 500,000 Taiwanese were killed in those days by the Japanese. And then, of course, and that, of course, is very more important also, there is, of course, a second issue at play here right now, and that, of course, is the United States. There is, of course, a very strong US-Japan alliance and a very strong, of course, Taiwan-US connection. And the diplomatic dispute right now between Tokyo and Beijing is obviously in direct favor of Washington. And it is quite remarkable that since this diplomatic incident broke out, that the US has been very quiet since Japan and started their back and forth. And this then suggests basically that the US has something to gain here. They're clearly not interested or not acting at all or trying to calm things down. They are just letting it go. And obviously that suggests there is something there for them to gain. And here also we have to look a bit back into, let's say, over the last decade, what happened. Because in recent years, and starting from the Biden era, basically, the United States is gradually easing the restriction of the Japanese military expansion, that the army. And of course, a control of the Japanese army, making Japan into a peaceful country, which very much was strong in the Constitution in 1945, and of course when the US occupied Japan. Now, however, this is changing, and now the US is more or less accepting that Japan is not only going to be a military base for its most significant strategic assets like the F-35, but it's also actually allowing Japan to perhaps to come into the military supply chain of the overall US build up and the build out in Asia Pacific. So then in this aspect, the statement on the Japanese prime minister is then, of course, interpreted in China as Japan is not acting in a vacuum. This statement is not coming out of nothing. It is perhaps implicit, with an implicit understanding or even acknowledgement from the United States, or even encouraged by the United States, in order, of course, to present a stronger military force to rebalance the military powers in the region. So perhaps dragging in Japan here, or pulling in Japan into this kind of rebalance between China and the US, of course, is in the very best interest of the United States, because it would strengthen its local allies without incurring greater military expenses. And of course, basically, that is what Trump wants. He doesn't want to spend more money on defense. Basically, they already have a massive budget of 1 trillion, but he wants the allies to pay for everything. And this, of course, suits that purpose, of course. And there is a very strong suspicion that the United States indeed is somehow behind all this, because basically, if you look what Germany has done over the last months in terms of the foreign minister Johann Wadepool, he criticized over the last months also China's increasingly aggressive behavior in Taiwan, basically, by having more ships and a bigger navy, and getting more into the Southeast Chinese Sea, which then, of course, led to an abruptly cancelled visit a few weeks ago, where Chinese officials basically didn't want to meet with the foreign minister of Germany. So you could see very clearly that Japan and Germany are more or less simultaneously trying to pressure China over Taiwan, and that obviously, as explained just now, benefits only one country, and that is the United States, obviously. And of course, in the meantime, this will hurt actually Japan and Germany. They have, as Trump himself would say, it's no cards to play. They have little leverage all over China, basically. But of course, as good lackeys from the United States, because in its essence, that's what it is, this is what they need to do. They need to incur some self-inflicting pain to keep daddy in Washington happy, basically, and to ensure that the US is not going to slap them again with tariffs. So here we see basically that Japan and Germany fall in line and do a bit of the dirty work vis-a-vis China, something that the US obviously should do. But now, of course, they have put Germany and Japan in front to do this a little bit. And of course, it will incur economic damage for both countries. But that is, of course, obviously not what Trump really cares about. So this basically, all of it is not just another kind of a spat among China and Japan. It is, on the one hand, this issue only shows the fear of a Japanese remilitarization, and it really drills down to some core fears of the Chinese, remembering what happened, of course, in history. And of course, on the other hand, you have this whole geopolitical concerted effort by the United States, where they use Japan and Germany basically in an effort to pressure China, and somehow trying to gain leverage, of course, something what Trump always loves to do, try to get leverage over everybody else in the world. But again, we will see here a kind of an absolute delusion from Japan and Germany, using the issue of the Taiwan as a stick to China, somehow thinking that something good will come out of this eventually. clearly not realizing, or maybe realizing, but maybe underestimating the fact there will be economic pain inflicted by China towards Germany and Japan. And in the long term, probably paying even a higher price because China is a country on the rise, which is shown, by the military parade and their leverage in the rare earth metals and so forth. And it will, and it has shown already what it can and will do if it feels pressured. Anyways, so another day, another delusion, basically, for some countries in the Western world. Now, what to expect in the future? Because obviously, China and Japan somehow need to mend and solve this problem and have to move on and find a way out. Now, of course, in countries where preserving face is essential, in China and even more in Japan, countries I both have been to many, many times, apologizing is very hard. And it will take some long discussions and some time to heal, or to at least get to talk to talking terms. Basically, the Chinese and its people basically are very furious, really furious. And again, as I said, it stokes up historical wounds, always something very sensitive in China. And of course, from Japanese side, the general public there is quite numb to Chinese rhetoric. And in fact, of course, this Beijing, the conduct from Beijing now, try to punish Japan economically, could of course help the Japanese prime minister advance her agenda, her very nationalistic agenda, by galvanizing public national support. And of course, keep in mind that most of her supporters are the younger Japanese, and there, of course, there is a kind of a historical knowledge which has faded away already. This, what happened in the Second World War was a long time ago for them, and obviously they're less aware and don't care maybe too much about what exactly happened in the Second World War. And of course, don't forget, in the Japanese history books, what happened in Southeast Asia and the Philippines and Korea and China and so forth is being portrayed in a different light than as the rest of the world actually knows it, of course. So there is a kind of a different historical tale being told in Japan about really what happened in the Second World War. And of course, this all influences current affairs. And of course, in China, they're very angry. In Japan, they don't care too much about anger in China, obviously speaking, for the general public. And that will take some time to sort this out. But again, this incident will not be forgotten in China very soon. It will only add to the idea that Japan, as they call it in Chinese, Xiaoribun, like small Japan, basically tries to pressure them. And of course, they have daddy behind them. And that, of course, will not make them happy at all. Anyways, I hope you liked the video. Please click the like button if you do. Please subscribe to the channel, and we see each other very, very soon. Bye bye.